To help us plan a more livable city, we are using sensors and other emerging technology to gather, analyze, and share data to make smart decisions about how we might respond to challenges facing our city. With the frequency of extreme heat events in urban environments, heat stress is becoming a major health concern for pedestrians navigating their way across the urban landscape. Sensors across the city measure localized information, including air quality, precipitation and humidity, shadows and shaded areas, and temperature throughout the day. We can draw on this data to inform planning of future cooling infrastructure where it is needed, and provide information on the coolest parts of the city to travel, so you can find the coolest route and move comfortably through the city any time of day.
We have to get a sense of reality.
What climate change is doing is attacking the basics of human existence.
At the turn of the century, there began to be recognition that there was a nexus between what's happening in climate change and national security.
We have no strategic leadership in a security sense on climate change.
We're seeing the profound impact of climate change right now.
The whole concept of a nation state may actually start disappearing.
Where will people go when they're dying of thirst?
This is a humanitarian crisis.
We cannot mess around with the future of civilization.
Investing in fossil fuels is like handing an AK-47 to your most sworn enemy. Why would you do that?
Well, hello and welcome to this fifth forum of the RESET.21 forum series. The aim of this series is to have some critical conversations that will move us forward and hopefully help us respond to the climate emergency that we face. This forum is called The Cooling Conundrum, Reversing Climate Change to Refreeze the Arctic. It's great to be with you. I'm Paul Barclay from ABC Radio National, where I'm the host of the Big Ideas program. I'm recording this session for my program. Before I proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we are meeting today, and pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present. Welcome to our online audience tuning in to this live stream. I was to be hosting this event from the wonderful and carbon neutral Capitol Theatre in Melbourne. However, the state of Victoria, as many of you will know, has just gone into COVID lockdown. So I'm coming to you via Zoom from my study at home. So excuse the background noise and the trains that will pass from time to time. The RESET.21 forum series would like to thank the major partners, the City of Melbourne, RMIT University, Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, and the Safe Climate Fund, and the aforementioned major venue partner, the Capitol, as I said, a carbon neutral theatre. This event is part of the National Sustainable Living Festival, which is on throughout the month of February. The RESET.21 forum series builds on the momentum generated at the 2020 National Climate Emergency Summit and helps reconnect and reset our action after an unprecedented year. Due to COVID restrictions, we'll be taking questions via slido.com. So make sure you've got Slido on your system. To submit your questions, just sign into the hashtag RESET21. So that's Slido, hashtag RESET21. You can also upvote any questions that others have asked. So if you like their questions, you can do so. Global temperatures, as we know, of course, are rising rapidly. We are already seeing serious harm to people and nature, devastating fires and cyclones and so on. There are increasing signs that we're on the brink of triggering runaway global warming as the strain on major ecosystems reaches a new level of stress. Some analysis suggests even a zero emissions pathway may not by itself be enough to slow warming and to avoid further demonstration. So this is leading many to say we need to urgently consider ways of immediately cooling the planet. But is reversing climate change a real possibility? What would it take to refreeze the Arctic and Antarctic ice and repair the climate? Well, to address this, we have three speakers in this forum. Let me introduce you firstly to our first speaker, who's joining us via Zoom from Alberta, Canada, David Keith. David has worked at the interface of climate science, energy technology and public policy since 1991. He is Professor of Applied Physics at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. David has led the development of Harvard's Solo Geoengineering Research Program. He is the founder of Carbon Engineering, a Canadian company developing technology to capture CO2 from ambient air to make carbon-neutral hydrocarbon fuels. Welcome to you, David.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Just to give you a bit more of a sense of place, because in the end, each person is in their own place. I'm speaking to you from Canmore, Alberta, where yesterday was -30, so about 50 degrees centigrade colder than it is in Melbourne now. And maybe you're not paying attention to Canadian politics, but there's been really big news here in the last couple months. We've got the most serious climate policy ever, by far, with carbon prices supposed to go to $170 a ton by 2030. And in a place that's dominated, as in the Australian economy, by minerals and mining and oil and gas, it's a big political deal to do that. And just to be even more personal, give you a sense of my life here, it was me on one of the big ice climbs of Canada Polar Circus about 2 weeks ago today. So it's a very different world here, I think, than Melbourne. Solar geoengineering is the idea that humans could deliberately alter the Earth's reflectivity or interfere with the way the Earth absorbs heat to reduce some of the risks of climate change. So let me first tell you how I think it might fit into the other things we do about climate. So this is a very simple schematic of the climate problem, and advance my slide. Here's a slightly more complicated version that I think gets at the core causal chain at the root of climate change. So to break the link between economic activity and emissions, because we have to bring net emissions to zero, that's decarbonization. It's the one thing we know we have to do. We have to remake the industrial infrastructure of the planet to switch it from high emissions to zero emissions. Then we might want to remove carbon dioxide from the air by a variety of methods. My view is that's pretty expensive and slow, and we mostly want to do it only once emissions are down towards zero. Then there's this thing we'll talk about, solar geoengineering, that can at least partially break the link between concentrations, the amount of CO2 that's built up in the atmosphere, and climate change. And that may be a powerful way to reduce climate risks over the next century, but it brings a lot of its own risks and governance challenges. And finally, there's all sorts of local adaptation measures. So to me, we need to think in 4 dimensions when we think about climate policy. That doesn't mean we necessarily do all those. Indeed, the one thing I would say is I would not say that solar geoengineering is necessary, or nor is carbon removal. And I wouldn't advocate doing solar geoengineering now. I would simply advocate that there's reason to believe that it's worth looking at. So here's a simple schematic of a bunch of methods for doing it. Happy to answer questions about them, but I won't go into them in detail. I will say that the method we know the most about, that's been the most studied, is putting aerosol particles into the stratosphere about twice as high as a regular commercial airplane flies. And I want to say a little bit about what we know about that. I think we know with good confidence that it would be technically possible to do it with basically existing hardware, and that the cost would be small enough that they're really not the issue. I think we know it would be possible to do it in a way that was roughly even, east to west and north to south. If you do observation, little feedback, I think you can say that with quite high confidence. There's lots we don't know. Lots we don't know about side effects, impacts on ozone, air pollution, etc. But there's stuff we do know. We've looked at that with every major climate model now, and I want to show you one really geeky slide. Maybe you'll think this is geeky enough, that to me makes the core case for why one might take this seriously. So this is a slide from one of the best climate models in the world, a very high resolution model that happens to do a very, very good job of getting tropical cyclones and local precipitation. And what we did is we divided the world into regions, standard regions that the IPCC uses. And in each of those regions, we're looking at 4 variables that are some of the most important variables for climate impacts: average temperature change, extreme temperature change, which drives a lot of human impacts, change in precipitation, and change in water availability, a thing that's P minus E or PE, which is the aridity or moisture in soils. And the way we do this test is we're in this model world, we're imposing solar geoengineering to roughly half the total climatic changes. And we're looking at whether on a regional basis, those variables are moderated, that is moved towards the pre-industrial, or exacerbated, moved away. Because one of the big concerns about solar geoengineering is that it will be equal. That while there's no question it's possible to cool the whole Earth, cooling isn't the issue. Nobody lives at the global average temperature. Nobody really cares about it. It's just a symbol. What we care about is local climate impacts that harm humans and ecosystems. And the question is, would these technologies cause a lot of local problems even if they reduce global temperatures? So we don't know for sure, but we know what the best models say. And the best models say, in this particular case, not a single variable in a single region is exacerbated. That is, is made further from pre-industrial. That may not be what actually happens in the real world, but this is a kind of consistent result that we've seen from a bunch of different models, and I think it's one of the central reasons to take this idea seriously. So I want to think about how it fits together over time. Warming is proportional to the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. So if we cut emissions to zero, central thing to know, we don't eliminate the problem of climate change, we just stop it getting worse. There's no question that different forms of carbon removal are possible with environmental impacts and money and so on. They can gradually pull emissions back down, but one can't do that arbitrarily quickly because there are real trade-offs, social trade-offs and cost trade-offs in doing it. So however we do that, and this graph, of course, has no money or time axes that have different versions that do this, it's just conceptual. To me anyway, and I don't necessarily have a right answer, I'm just giving you my opinion, the way to use solar geoengineering, if we use it at all, is to cut the top of the curve off, to use it temporarily, not to use it as a substitute for emissions cuts, to use it as a supplement in a way to reduce the worst harms. That's my view of how to think about using it. And now, I want to say a little bit about sort of the underlying justification in politics. Obviously, the central reason why people often don't want to think about this or attack it, central reason for what might be called a taboo, is a concern, I think a justifiable concern, that this will be used as an excuse to avoid emissions cuts. And I take that very seriously. But I want to say a little bit more about what I think should be the motivation. I could show you some nerdy papers that suggest that solar geoengineering would benefit some of the poorest in the world the most, that it would actually reduce global income inequality, and that if you compare cooling a little bit by reducing emissions or carbon removal to cooling a little bit with solar geoengineering, you ask which is more effective at protecting crop yields which will suffer, crop yields will go down for many crops under strong warming. You ask which is more effective, it turns out that solar geoengineering is more effective according to the kind of best crop model that's built into a climate model, the NCAR climate model. Again, might not be true. That's all a lot of facts. But I want to end by saying that it turns out that a year ago, last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in Bangladesh, where I'd been invited by some of the developing world leaders in sort of work on climate impacts and leading advocates. And they invited me to speak about this technology and to engage with them about how it would be governed and how they might end up being involved with it. There's been a lot of talk, I think justifiable worry that this is just a rich white person's game to avoid the consequence of emissions, and maybe that's true for some people, but for folks living in Bangladesh, they want to understand how these things can be used to reduce their climate risks. And after that, I went down to the Delta, some of the poorest regions in Bangladesh, talked from one of these to a local community leader called Ronnie, a little farm with a wood stove that she's built. These are people who make a handful of dollars a day. And when I think about the next half century and the kind of climate impacts that will be very real there, and in a sense, more real, I mean, they're very real in Australia, but there's, in a richer country, more ability to manage those impacts. I think that it's important that we take these technologies seriously, not necessarily do them, but we take them seriously, we develop them, we understand them, we begin a conversation that won't be perfect, but a conversation that is as inclusive as possible about how on earth we govern these technologies and make decisions about using them, especially in the interests of the people who are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. We'll certainly follow up on some of the points you made in the panel discussion a little later on. And remember, for the audience watching online, you can fire your questions through on Slido. Joining us now via Skype from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Ye Tao. Dr. Tao is a fellow and principal investigator at the Rowland Institute at Harvard. He is trained in several fields and engineering. Dr. Tao is the founder of Project Near Reflection, a comprehensive adaptive mitigation framework that has the potential to stop the ongoing ecological collapse on planet Earth that's projected to be widespread by 2050 if we continue on our current trajectory. Welcome, Ye.
Hi, do you guys see my screen?
Yes, I can see you.
Great. So first of all, happy Chinese New Year to everybody who celebrates. And I'm joining you from the land of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag Nations. And what I present today, I just like to clarify our understanding of framework near reflection and does not represent the official position of Harvard. The indigenous people of this land understood Homo sapiens' place in the biosphere and accordingly lived sustainably millennia. And they've survived colonization and an ongoing genocide. Given our shared human experience, I just want to express my admiration for their resilience and also to learn from all the marginalized peoples and their leaders and their experience and draw inspiration and courage from this experience for this ongoing global struggle for justice, equity, unity, and hopefully pan-human prosperity following ecosystem stewardship. So with that, I think we have been somehow reducing the fight to a one-dimensional tug of war against very powerful forces. And some of those forces are probably our own doing. Everybody wants to have a comfortable life and access to money and food. So are we doing ourselves a disfavor by oversimplifying the climate problem? In foreseeable future, you have a linear relationship between, say, CO2 and the temperature, roughly speaking, and by various measures, including like variance. But this simplification becomes somewhat irrelevant when we're trying to understand the impact on very complex ecosystems. For example, if we look at the growth rate of a simple plant, in this case, it's soybeans. While the growth rate increases with increasing CO2 concentration, we see that if thermal extremes bring the environmental temperature over the thermal optimum, then we have a very drastic, sharp decrease in the growth rate. And this sort of sharp failure, crop failure, when temperature goes above 30 degrees C is quite common among most of the plants that we have access to as food. So climate change is actually a highly multidimensional problem with many variables. And we really need to treat it as such. And this results in this slide are compiled by my students, Rithi, Ellie, Alfredo, and Asia. And they're all college students in the United States in different schools. So we need to take climate change from the perspective of ecosystem. And from this perspective, we see that even 2 degrees Celsius increase can be too much for marine organisms over very short periods of exposure. And coral reefs have been almost decimated by also similar, couple degrees increase in ocean temperature. And experimental studies of like 34 species finds that all of them are not really tolerant to even 2 or 3 degrees sustained increase in environmental temperature. And controlled experiments exposing land plants to only 2.6 degrees Celsius increase in temperature held over several years shows that they basically have much reduced fertility, much reduced longevity, and consequently undergo local extirpation or local extinction. So a few years ago, we heard of this insect apocalypse when 2 groups found that insects' biomass in 2 different locations on Earth seemed to be decaying exponentially with a time constant of about 12 years. I think any scientist hearing such news should be at least concerned or interested, because it's quite surprising that an entire phylum of organisms that's successful for billions of years are suddenly decaying with the time constant of a isotope of hydrogen, tritium. So I paid attention, and recently there's this paper showing large-scale correlation between thermal stress and decay in abundance for bumblebees. So perhaps there is a thermal link in this insect apocalypse. And these authors also found that land use was nowhere as significant as the thermal stress in explaining the observations. We know that marine heat waves will be increasing based on the first series of this conference. And even under very drastic mitigation, we will still have much increased direct exposure of marine organisms and also indirect effects on ecosystems for malnutrition. And another paper from last year suggests that we have until the next 10 years or so to come back on the right path if we were to avoid global level ecological collapse and calamity. So what can we do? Well, let's come back to the basics for a moment. So to make any changes to our system, we need to consider the energy limitations and the material limitations. We also need to abide by physical laws, available technology, and our values and policies. We call that just information. And taking all the constraints, actually we would find there's actually very little choice that we have. And if we also take into consideration the state of the ecosystem, then we have even less choice. And what I'm gonna tell you about right now is our best attempt at coming up with a potential framework that's at the intersection of all the different constraints presented to us. And it's called the project Mirror Reflection. We try to use glass mirrors to perform various functions, both to generate renewable electricity and to cool the ecosystem, and potentially even to inhibit the catastrophic release of methane. So our project, we take as definition for sustainability when we take resource from the environment at the same rate that we recycle them back in the same form. If all the source rates and sink rates are engineered to be equal, then in principle, we should have a stable system. But of course, we have to consume energy in the process. And in the long run, the only sustainable form of energy is sunlight. So here is our thinking of the roadmap. First of all, we think that installing some cooling mirrors would allow us to gradually ramp down our dependence on fossil fuel, because we know that when we burn fossil fuel, we also generate aerosols that can significantly cool the Earth. And if we let go of that too quickly, there could be actually devastating ecological impacts. So we need to do it in a controlled manner. And when we have less fossil fuel burning, we'll have clearer skies and better air, and also more solar direct normal irradiance. And direct sunlight will also favor the efficiency of a range of concentrating solar technologies, including solar thermal, electricity generation, and also material synthesis. And MIR, of course, can also help these technologies by providing readily accessible heliostats. And these renewable technologies would in turn also help increase the rate of ramping down fossil fuel economy. Cooling mirrors, when they're installed along with agricultural fields, can also lead to lower environmental temperature and the lower water use as a form of adaptation. And together, lower temperature and more efficient use of land and stopping further acidification using solar thermal technology can help ecosystem recovery, which then could help other natural solutions from drawing down carbon by providing better temperature overall on the planet. So we did an assessment of the cooling potential of mirrors installed on the ground. And in many parts of the world, we can expect up to 100 to 150 watt per square meter of local radiative cooling. So we can ask the question, how big of a mirror do you need to offset the heating effect of 1 ton of CO2? The calculation is pretty hard, and it's basically, we can take the total radiative forcing of CO2 divided by the total content of CO2 in the atmosphere to get the global radiative forcing per each ton of CO2. It's roughly 2 times 10 to the minus 12 watt per meter squared per ton of CO2. We can do the same calculation for mirrors using a reasonable number of minus 100 watt per meter squared of local radiative forcing. And we get a number which is 10 times less than in absolute values compared to the CO2 heating potential. So that means we basically need a mirror that's 10 meters squared, roughly, to offset the heating effect of CO2. And such a mirror should cost somewhere between $1 and $10 when produced on large scale. And the lower bound, $1, is based on the energy needed to manufacture such a device. And the upper bound, $10, is based on a commercially available mirrors that you can buy today. So can we really claim that mirror is equal to drawing down CO2? Actually, we can't for many reasons. But there's one beneficial effect, which is when CO2 is high, plants use water more efficiently because their stomata doesn't need to be opened as much to have the same influx of CO2 for photosynthesis. But of course, we still have the ocean acidification problem left. We can go into a discussion of that later today, hopefully, of how the mirror framework can also address this problem. So is the scheme sustainable? Well, glass is pretty readily available, and they're 100% recyclable, chemically stable, mechanically stable, and also non-toxic, very importantly. So this work was compiled by Dr. Xiaohui Han, who's a volunteer for our project. And soda lime glass in particular is made up of silicon, sodium, calcium, magnesium, aluminum. And incidentally, they are some of the most abundant material in the Earth's crust. We have 1,000 gigaton of soda lime glass reserve globally. If somehow we decided as a civilization to devote all of that to making mirrors, then we can have enough mirrors to provide a global cooling of -8 watt per meter squared. Of course, assuming that the cooling scales of linear obviously needs much additional research. And we know that beyond current levels of CO2 levels, every 100 ppm will incur about 1 watt per meter squared, which means we have enough glass to cancel the heating effect of up to about 1,000 ppm in CO2. Obviously, there's many other problems that we need to come back to. So what about energy requirements? So it turns out that the energy or CO2 emitted in the fabrication of each mirror is only 10% of the CO2 that the mirror can offset. And we can do better by making the mirrors not using fossil fuel energy, but using solar thermal energy, in which case we can have a 100-to-1 ratio. So if we did this process in Western Australia, each mirror, if we use it to capture more energy for subsequent mirrors, it can replicate itself roughly after 1 week of usage in the field. So it's potentially a self-replicating process, at least from an energy availability point of view. And in our team, Mohan, who's a high school student, is working with my postdoc Hua in designing a lab-scale system to try to make mirrors using solar thermal energy. So I promised that I would come back to ocean acidification problem. We know that as the ocean acidifies, they will lose gradually buffering capacity, and the annual swing in pH in the ocean and acidity will increase over time. And at a certain point, it will become too much for the ecosystem to tolerate by the second half of the century. So let's not go to that point. We also know that at these eutrophication will also be much worsened and cause like a significant decreased pH. There's another problem that we cannot allow to happen, which is the disappearance of clouds when CO2 level gets above 1,000 ppm. So it's absolutely necessary that we draw down CO2 after we have gotten the thermal problem under control. So here is a scheme to do that, powered by sunlight. So let's imagine that you're a CO2 molecule in the air. You are diffusing everywhere, carried by the air, and eventually you will encounter the ocean surface. And there you go, you dissolve into the ocean because there's a concentration gradient. And once you're dissolved, the molecule will dissociate into different ions. And some of them, when you're close to calcifying organisms like clams and bivalves, they can be captured and fixed into the shell in the form of calcium carbonate. And this process is essentially powered by phytoplankton, which are primary producers that's very abundant in the ocean. One can imagine that we harvest the clam and separate the shell and use solar thermal heat to decompose the shell into calcium oxide and CO2. The calcium oxide can potentially be used to provide heating to local fishing villages and also other residential communities. And the CO2 can be either made into into fuel through electrochemical reduction, for example, or they can also be buried underground. So in the scheme, we see that the CO2, after is consumed by automobile for transportation, goes back to the atmosphere but it's a closed loop. So the process is in principle carbon neutral. But of course, if we want to really draw down CO2 from the atmosphere, then we'd rather inject the gas into underground storage, according to methods that David is expert on. So we're also trying to test the system in order to perform this solar thermal decomposition of oyster shells in our lab. And we have some preliminary experiment, not using solar thermal energy, but just electrical furnace. And we showed that the shells decompose very well to calcium oxide. And the particles that are formed are actually very small. So that's very favorable for subsequent use in hydration reaction. So we think there's significant potential for scaling this process globally. So to perform bivalve mariculture, we need roughly like 2 milligrams per meter cubed of chlorophyll or phytoplankton. And that's quite abundant globally. And right now, 80% or more of the aquaculture is performed along certain coastline of China. So there's a lot of coastline to scale the process. But right now we have only roughly 3 megaton per year of CO2 flux. So that's obviously very small, but there's certainly room to increase to a fraction of a gigaton. And the currently produced calcium oxide, if we were to perform this process, can provide heating for most of the aquaculture communities. So lastly, I would like to draw a parallel between the function of mirrors for Earth versus the function of an AC for a house. So to cool your house, you need to run electricity, let's say at a power of Q. So with that kind of consumption, you can remove heat from your house at a rate of 3Q. So the energy input for making the mirrors is roughly the energy of fabrication. And once it's made, it doesn't consume much more energy. But over a typical service lifetime of, like, say, 30 years, we can expect 3,000 times that energy removed. But of course, the air conditioning unit also produces CO2, and that traps additional heat for the Earth. So this analysis suggests that mirrors can be a very efficient cooling device for the planet. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge members of Mirror Reflection, and also the founder of Rowland Institute, Edwin H. Land, and his vision for giving, enabling freedom to pursue this research, which is a departure from my original training in experimental physics.
Thank you very much, Ye. We'll maybe have some time to talk more about why all of us should be eating more oysters and where we're going to put all of those mirrors a little later on. Let me, though, now introduce you to our third speaker joining us from New York, Holly Jean Buck. Holly Jean is an expert in the social and political dimensions of environmental policies and strategies and technologies for preventing and adapting to climate change. Holly's an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University in Buffalo, New York. Her book, After Geoengineering, Climate Change, Repair and Restoration, examines best case scenarios. She's written on several aspects of climate engineering, including humanitarian and development approaches to geoengineering, gender considerations, and also human rights issues. A big welcome to you, Holly.
Thanks so much. So I was invited to speak on a variety of things, including the moral argument for solar geoengineering, how it should be used, why it's been taboo, and what governance would be required. No big deal. I'm just gonna, take 10 minutes to give some very brief thoughts on a couple of those points. As I think you've gleaned from this discussion already, the moral argument for research on solar geoengineering is that it may be better than not doing it, depending on the counterfactual scenario. And I think there's a responsibility to learn more in this case, in the case that it could ameliorate some climate suffering, especially when you think about sea level rise, coastal megacities, things that are farther down the line, but we can see coming. And the calculus of all of this hinges on how bad you think the climate change picture is. I want to point out that we have some good news. Coal seems to be on its way out in many places. Solar has become incredibly cheap, the price of it falling 89% in the last 10 years. Costs of onshore wind dropped 70%. So you could argue that the worst case scenarios are less likely, perhaps headed for a bad 3 degrees of warming instead of an apocalyptic 4 degrees. But we also have roadmaps for 2 degrees or less. I think it's pretty clear we know what needs to be done. Whether those roadmaps or trajectories that we can see but aren't fully on rule out solar radiation management depends on several things, including the risk profile and impacts of it, which we need more research to understand. So with climate, the problem I'm seeing right now is that instead of talking about decades-long economic and climate planning, we have this rhetoric of emergency. So instead of thinking about building institutions that can do that, emergency might actually be a register that's contrary to what we need. And here's what a discourse of emergency has brought us in the last year. 103 countries have passed emergency declarations due to the pandemic. According to research by Freedom House, the think tank, democracy has declined in 80 countries over the past year. They found evidence of police violence against civilians in at least 59 countries. One interviewee in that research in Cambodia told the researchers the government took coronavirus as the opportunity to demolish democratic space. So in Cambodia, the state of emergency law included unlimited surveillance of communications, restrictions on freedom of movement and assembly, seizing of private property, and, quote, other measures that are deemed appropriate and necessary in response to the state of emergency. In Sri Lanka, the regime ordered the arrest of anyone who criticizes or contradicts the official position on the coronavirus. In the Philippines, arrests are frequently carried out for violations as simple as a mask while crossing a border. In Hungary, the regime passed a law allowing the prime minister to rule by decree for an indefinite period of time. In Kenya, police fired tear gas and beat commuters ahead of imposing curfew. In Azerbaijan, in Uganda, opposition leaders have been arrested as part of COVID-19 restrictions. And in the state of emergency, elections have been disrupted around the world. Governments have also targeted and marginalized migrant communities for discrimination using COVID emergency as a pretext, including in countries like India, where Modi's government enacted strict local lockdowns and singled out neighborhoods that had previously protested changes to citizenship laws. And so, as The Economist notes, measuring the pandemic's effect on democracy and human rights is hard. But they also ask, without COVID-19, would China's rulers still have inflicted such horrors on Muslim Uyghurs this year? Would Thailand's king have grabbed nearly absolute powers? And moreover, the ability to bear these emergency measures is deeply unequal. A study from researchers at the United Nations University found that in Africa, only 6.8% of households had the ability to stay home without serious harms to their health and welfare. So, to be clear, there's no shortage of human rights abuses and egregious penalties in our own countries. This is not a problem exclusively of developing countries. But think about all of this experience. Think about the loss to democracy and human rights from the state of emergency and quick responses, and now to a climate emergency. Are we really looking at a better situation? This is not a good starting place for a discussion of solar geoengineering, because not only might we get a poor implementation of SRM from the emergency rhetoric, from the panic and then this need to perform a strong response, we get this other damage to democracy, which may be at odds with the kind of long-term planning that we need for these larger institutions and programs. And we're kind of in a bind, I think, because there's already a community of people who is under the belief that COVID lockdowns were a warm-up for climate lockdowns. So this group of people has already been suspecting that elites with PhDs want to dictate where you can go, who you can meet with, etc. And now these people have a year of lived experience that offers to them proof of this. And the more we talk about climate emergency and try to double down on it, the more these people will get upset about the potential for restrictions upon their behavior, their way of life, their values, whatever. So I think we're going in the wrong direction with this. I don't think emergency is the right tenor for the work ahead. War is also an incorrect analog. I don't think we need a war on climate change. I think our task is to develop an entirely sort of climate politics for this next decade. And I think that a post-COVID climate politics needs to promote long-term planning within a context of urgency, not emergency, and emphasize the type of social organization and social relations that are capable of multi-generational planning. There's really no analog for what we have to do now. We can grasp at, war or the Apollo project or whatever, but this is pretty new. We have to become a global society that directs its own destiny and shapes its own environment that can come up with a plan. And we haven't done that before. It requires new language, new institutions, new narratives, new images. I think the closest language we might have had is something like the German energy and the energy transition. Only this is about more than energy. It also involves waste systems, agriculture, etc. So there's languages of the circular economy, of sustainable food systems that are all relevant. They're a bit perhaps less click-worthy, but more productive registers than emergency. And so we need to talk about solar geoengineering in the context of developing a decades-long plan. And governance then means building institutions that can see that through. In the last minute or two, I wanted to come back to the Arctic, which was the theme of this, and governance in relation to the Arctic, right? Because 4 million people live there, they need to be shaping what happens there. And in research done with colleagues at the Arctic Center in Lapland, namely Ilona Metianian, who I'm very grateful to as a colleague, we talked to people about this and heard concerns from respondents about the Arctic being a place where pollutants end up through the food chain, as the Arctic is a place inevitably affected from outside. So we need to talk about that history of being on the periphery or feeling on the periphery of where decisions are made. And there exist institutions like the Arctic Council or the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which should really be at the forefront of these conversations. And it's incumbent on researchers and their funders especially to do the work of creating those conversations. But it's not going to be inviting for people who live there or elsewhere to engage when frames and ideas are already set and sketched out, because these communities are already overwhelmed with engaging with researchers around climate action. They're on the front lines of climate change. So probably they might find it more worth their time to spend time on things that directly matter to their livelihoods or that they know will bring benefits rather than these more speculative things. So how do we democratize the process of decision making? That's another thing I was asked to comment on. We really need to focus on the time that it takes to do that engagement, which may be, again, conflicting with this register of emergency. But building these relationships, it's relational labor. It's often gendered or not incentivized, invisibilized. It takes time and energy and listening and a willingness to change your ideas. And I'm not the one to answer or speak to this really about the Arctic in particular. But what I do know is that we do have time to build capacity to have those discussions. Climate change is urgent, but it demands a measured, calm response and an emphasis on planning rather than simply emergency. So thanks for the chance to comment, and I look forward to our discussions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Holly, and thanks to Ye and David. I'm going to be talking to the three of them for a while, and then we'll wrap up on some audience questions. David, I'll come to you first of all. I mean, as Holly just said there, really, that the calculus or the case for geoengineering tends to rest on how bad you see the warming problem as being. I mean, how much, for example, that warming is already locked in, even if we manage to get to net zero emissions in the next 10, 15 years or so. I mean, you made the point at the beginning of your presentation that you're not advocating solar geoengineering now. So I suppose the question is, how bad does it have to get before you would advocate it?
I think Holly's right on about the emergency framing. I have consistently felt that that was unhelpful in the way to think about climate, because climate is a long problem of learning to live with each other on this planet over kind of a century timescale. And I think the reason why people want to think about this in terms of thresholds of 1.5 or 2 degrees and construct an emergency is because it seems like it's a more politically effective way to get action. And maybe that's true. I'm not an expert at getting political action, but I think there are certainly ways in which that framing can backfire, ways that are important. I actually think that the central decisions with the ethics as I see them for solar geoengineering are not very dependent on how bad the climate problem is or on exactly how much emissions we have. I think the central decisions are really about the ratio of the benefits of solar geoengineering in terms of reduced damages, reduced number of people who die from heat stress, reduced ecological damages, damages to places that we love, compared to the risks of doing it, and to both the physical risks and to the risks of disrupting the political system. But I think that it's tempting to want to decide everything at once. All climate things, but we have many other problems in society, not just climate. And I think you do, of course, have to think about the interactions of problems, but sometimes that can overcomplicate things. Fundamentally, the decision about implementation of solar geoengineering, like many other decisions, should be based on its benefits versus its harms.
And what is the current modelling then telling us about what we could expect to see as the likely outcome of solar radiation management deployment on this urgent problem?
So the current results from models, from really the whole suite of climate models, suggest that if you did it using these methods that can be pretty even globally, so aerosols in the stratosphere or space-based methods, but other ones as well, that if you do that and if you make a choice, which is not a technologically forced, it's a political choice to do it evenly, that you could cut climate risks by more than half. You cut temperature rise in half and cut climate risk by more than half because the risks rise steeply with climate. So if you're talking about many sort of objective measures of flood frequencies or number of people who would die or would be harmed by high temperatures, or some measures of the ecological velocity, the rate at which ecosystems are being forced to migrate, as has happening, here in northwestern Canada very quickly from climate change. The evidence is that you could, I think, cut those roughly in half. So that's a very big deal. It's reducing the climate problem by a very substantial amount. That appears to be possible.
Okay, just a quick follow-up with you, David, before I go to Yay and talk about mirrors, reflective mirrors. Is there a geoengineering method that you prefer? You didn't really touch on that in your presentation. Is there something that's most feasible, most effective, say, for example, the delivering of sulfates into the stratosphere, for example?
You ask, I'm sorry to be an academic's answer, but this isn't a value-free thing. You've got to ask most useful for what. I think a lot about weaponization and side effects. So I'd say I'm strongly biased. I'm a kind of collective person. So this isn't a scientific judgment. I think it's important that we choose technologies that are hard to localize, technologies that give a pretty even global effect, because I think that makes the governance problem easier. And technologies that have short timescales and are local, like cirrus thinning or marine cloud brightening, I think no question they could be used well, but I think they have greater temptations to be used for weather control or to be used in a way that harms one area and helps another. So I think that they're a harder governance challenge. And that'd be true for mirrors too. But this is a separate question. So I think in general, things that are more even and are harder to localize probably will end up being easier to control and provide more benefits with less harms.
Yeah, you were talking about reflective mirrors, and the potential of them to reduce temperature. What would happen if everyone just put mirrors on the roofs of their houses? Is that feasible, and to what extent would something like that have a significant impact on this problem?
That would certainly help lower local temperatures, but the major problem is that there's not enough roof space in the world to sustainably achieve cooling at the level that's necessary in the coming decades.
I think you were saying in a talk I heard you give that you would need somewhere like 2 to 3% of the Earth's surface to be dedicated to mirrors to bring down temperature sufficiently. Is that correct?
That's roughly the level that's needed if we want to roughly cool back to pre-industrial conditions. But if we're willing to just hold conditions stable while we decarbonize, very importantly, then we do not need such a massive scale implementation right away. We can do that piecemeal, year by year, gradually at a rate that's commensurate with our contemporary emissions at the time.
How would you even go about that scale of a project, of rolling out that many mirrors?
Yes, so mirror approach is certainly much more challenging engineering-wise than many other methods. But I think that's also a good thing in a sense, because it really would require deliberation, careful deliberation by people making the decision before it's actually implemented. So at that scale, we are faced with several technical challenges. First of all, how do we make that much glass? It's a dramatic ramping up of the global glass manufacturing capability, and hopefully in a solar thermal fashion. And also, even when you have the glass, you need to make them into reflectors of the proper properties. And that also needs to happen very quickly. So there's material science engineering challenges, but we think we have ideas on how to approach those problems at the scale that's required.
And just briefly, what are those ideas?
So right now, we would like to really want to share all the information freely to the world, but unfortunately, we operate in a world where patents and other things just mean a thing. If we had the patent, we would freely license as an organization to everybody who wants to use it. But we want to prevent the unfortunate potential happening that some companies patented after hearing this idea and prevented people from using it for societal good. So I like to refrain from giving specific details of how we think it's scalable at the rate that's required.
Holly, of course, there's been a great deal of hostility toward geoengineering, we want to call it that, from many in the environment movement and on the progressive side of politics. To what extent is their skepticism warranted?
I mean, there's a few different potential cultural values-based drivers for it. I think the one I find most credible is the potential for solar geoengineering to be a disingenuous stopgap. So we're familiar with a lot of stopgap measures. It's kind of a pattern of our time because we lack these institutions for long-term planning. So we get these interim measures from, interim storage for nuclear waste to forest carbon offsets. That's just in the environmental domain. I mean, they crop up in kind of every domain. And people are concerned that, it'll just be a stopgap that doesn't help us buy time for decarbonization. The decarbonization isn't followed up. and then we're just stuck doing more and more. So that's a concern that the environmental movement and I share.
That in a sense, we're looking at a potential moral hazard with this technology because business and governments would just give up on mitigation and rely solely on this technology as the solution or the let-off, really.
I don't think they'll give up on mitigation. They'll still keep talking about it. It's just like, as you go down that curve, it gets harder and harder and more expensive. And it's, you know, the residual emissions we're looking at in a lot of net zero scenarios are, you know, 10 billion tons a year. And the idea is that the carbon removal will compensate at 10 billion tons a year, but there's big constraints on carbon removal at that scale. So we'll just keep getting this 10 billion tons a year and this little bit of solar geoengineering, you know, up into the next century. I could see that happening.
So politically in Australia, we're preoccupied with this argument about zero net emissions by whenever. And currently that debate here is getting broad-based political support for net zero emissions by 2050. That's the kind of where this argument is at now. Clearly, people who know a lot more about this are saying the next decade really is critical. But there are some people who are basically saying that, look, right now, through the emissions that have already gone into the atmosphere, we're facing 2 to 3 degrees warming, even if we meet, even if we reach net zero, that warming is just locked in. So basically, I suppose the question is there any alternative but to embrace some form of geoengineering? That's to you, Holly. Mm-hmm. And then maybe to David.
I mean, I'm all for embracing carbon removal. And it's important to understand that carbon removal at large scales implies that there's cheap, abundant, renewable energy to power a lot of these processes. And you could even argue in some ways that that scale of renewables that we're imagining to get to net zero is a form of terraforming itself, because it's huge land implications for the infrastructure, in my view. But I'm curious what David might say about this idea of 2 to 3 degrees being locked in.
David?
That's not supported by the science as I understand it. So I don't think that's correct, but nobody knows, but that's not the standard wisdom. I don't think we need to do solar geoengineering. These are choices. And I think people's claims about something being necessary are mostly ways to rhetoric to avoid the hard political trade-offs. And a lot of these have been built around this 1.5, which, remember, is a political decision, maybe a good or bad one, but it's not a scientific claim that there's a threshold there. That's very clearly not been made by the scientific community. So my view is there are absolutely alternatives to doing solar geoengineering, is not to do it, to cut emissions and have more warming. No question. I think it's tempting to assume that the kind of big technological methods like solar geoengineering are more ecologically dangerous than some others. And I think it's you got to really look at the numbers. You can't assume. So really large scale carbon removal by most of the methods that I know, done really quickly, will have ecological implications that, as I read it, and I remember worked on both things. I have even a financial stake in one of the carbon removal companies, and I was one of the first people to work on biomass for capture. So I don't think I have a bias one way or the other. As I read the literature, the environmental impacts on the environment that I care about would be a lot bigger doing this with rapid CDR than they would be with solar geoengineering. And I think it's important to think about some of these trade-offs. So putting aerosols in the stratosphere, because we know aerosols kill, well, most recently we've estimated about 8 million people a year, so it's sensible to be very concerned. But I think we also, if we're going to believe the science about CO2, we need to believe what the science says about the impacts of aerosols in the stratosphere, something we know about. And they don't support the idea of very big side effects. And we do know that some of these other things would have big side effects. And to be clear, some of these surface schemes, like mirrors, might seem safer. By the way, that mirror idea was first brought to the world's attention in a report in 1965. It's not a new idea. But in general, these surface schemes will have bigger environmental impact because you have to move much more material. And you, when you start to look at that, I'm involved right now in a careful life cycle assessment. One of these surface schemes is about putting little glass beads on the Arctic. And I think there are definitely ways it could work, but the environmental impacts turn out to be pretty big on a kind of per unit cooling basis.
And not just the environmental arguments. I mean, I'm thinking of a country like Australia, which has an enormous amount of desert where, in theory, you could place these reflective mirrors. However, much of that land is land occupied and owned by Indigenous people. And there would need to be a long and complicated discussion with them about this.
And so both by Indigenous people and if the goal here, I mean, what are we doing all this for? We're doing it to protect humans, but also to protect the natural environment, to leave the environment for our great grandkids more like we found it, to reduce the human footprint. And we need to think as we deal with climate about how much we create other environmental problems, because there are sharp trade-offs here. And humans have the biggest footprint on the environment now is not climate, it's agriculture and other side products of human action. And climate will be the biggest over this century, but we need to think seriously about the environmental side effects of the other choices. It's easy to say it's all powered on renewables, but if that renewables is wind and biofuels, and you're doing a 10 gigaton scale CDR, that's an environmental holocaust. Let's just be honest about the number.
Yeah. Can we talk about something you touched on earlier, liming the oceans using calcium oxide and your proposition that could help us address global warming. Do you think that is, because we've been talking, I suppose, for a while about the prospect of some form of carbon capture, do you think this is shaping up as the best carbon capture option?
So the merit of this strategy is that shellfish is a very valuable product, and they also perform a range of ecosystem functions like the water purification and controlling, fouling in some waterways. And there is certainly enough ocean area to make this a larger scale operation. So I see the nutritional content of marine bivalves like oysters and clams as something that potentially replaces land-based protein like beef and goats and sheep. So that can have other co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gas from bypassing those nutritional needs. So I do see this as has value that in that sense. And
sorry, just to drill down a bit. So you would gradually shift protein-based diets away from beef, lamb and so forth, get people to eat more shellfish, for example. The byproduct of the shellfish, you'd then be able to, in the case of oysters, bake in these giant solar furnaces, and then you'd break them down, put them into the ocean, and this would help de-acidify the ocean and remove CO2. If done at scale.
If done at scale, yes. And they also provide some buffering effects for coastal communities. So if they're placed, if the calcium hydroxide is placed close to the oyster farms, then that also provides the calcium that's needed for the next generation, next batch of oysters and bivalves. So it's basically calcium can be conceptualized in this case as a pump that pumps CO2 from the ocean, catalyzed by the biological activity of marine bivalves.
Sorry, David.
Yeah, so this scheme, the calcium oxide scheme is one I take pretty seriously. It was proposed by Harun Keshki about, I think in the late 90s. He and I wrote about it in an earlier IPCC. And I think it's one of the more scalable schemes. The business of using marine mammals may or may not be useful, but the obvious thing you do to me is you just do lime production, capture the CO2 and put it underground. And it is, I think, one of the most scalable CDR techniques, but We don't know how big the environmental impacts are, and there are really big unanswered questions about your ability to actually do it and get dissolution before the particles sink. And so there's a bunch of basic research that hasn't been done, and this shows you the trendiness of this stuff. So in all the work on CDR, there's basically nobody working on that topic, despite the fact that I think some of us old guys and gals who may be wrong would think it would be one of the more useful things to work on, but it's not fashionable, so it doesn't get exercise.
So, Holly, we're hearing about a range of possibilities here, some possible risks as well, some possibly large benefits in terms of addressing global warming. I suppose my question to you is, how do we as a community go about having a discussion about this? Because I think really, especially what David is saying here, is that this is not about scientists pushing an idea onto us, the public. This is about us being aware of what options there are and our governments being aware of it, and us engaging in that process and deciding, in a sense, how we would like to go forward. How do we create the conditions where we can best have that conversation?
That's a great question. I think one of the challenges is having the expertise to evaluate some of these ideas, because it's just kind of a frontier of ideas. And if you're not an expert in them, as I'm not, I'm a sociologist by training, it takes some time and some research to figure out which ideas might be good, which would have side effects that people from other domains would know about. And so one thing I think people can do is demand more, transparent, publicly funded assessments of these things, just to have authoritative information that everybody can trust, and then everybody can be on the same page about what the impacts might be. I mean, that seems like a very simple, good first step.
I should make it clear too that, Holly, you're not too fond of the term geoengineering, are you? Can you explain why?
I think I'm not alone in this. I think that it kind of overpromises. Nobody I've met actually thinks you could engineer the Earth, because there's a level of precision there that we don't have. So we can intervene in a system and watch what happens and modulate our intervention. I think that might be the best we can do. But even these umbrella terms may not be so useful in the end.
Mm. And Yay, as a scientist who's been working in this field and studying the possibility, doing some of the modeling around some of these ideas, how do you think we as a society should move on this? I mean, how do you think, for example, scientists get the social license to perhaps proceed with some of these ideas, take it from the research phase into the practice phase?
I think it's very important to involve the public and stakeholders as much as possible. And at Mirror Reflection Project, where basically volunteers, everybody's devoting their time for free to look at this issue. And the average age is like 23, 24. So these are college-age students who see the project as one potential path to a livable future for themselves and their families and their loved ones. So I think being open about the progress of the research and sharing the results with the world openly is one way forward. So we're also starting collaboration with the open education community in the northeast of the US, trying to bring this mirror reflection research model to university campuses in 2 years and 4-year colleges more widely. So I think the one merit of mirror that I would want to highlight is actually local testability on small scale may not be a bad thing. We can really test on an experimental farm in any university campus how crops respond to mirror placement over them. Do they grow worse or better? Is water saving a dominant effect at the moment? Or is heat alleviation the dominant effect, or light deprivation. So we can really do these localized tests on small scale without having to worry about immediately impacting people in other parts of the world who do not have a say in such experiments. So I see local testability and stability as actually very important attributes. So if one day we decided as a humanity, together we each have tested this thing locally, we're happy with the results, so let's scale it up. And as one way to build towards a carbon neutral civilization, once we make that decision, we want to build infrastructure which is stable against the economic downturns and the COVID 2029. So the stability element will enable us to ride out future events without having to worry about another climate overheating to worry about. So I would like to back disagreement with David. I do see stability of the infrastructure to be important.
And David, just in terms of how we go forward, if we go forward with some of these technological options, I mean, as you've, I think, expressed really well, I mean, these are choices that we make, and there are choices on the table, and all choices have benefits and downsides. Even, for example, reducing carbon emissions through fossil fuel burning. Countries that are wealthy and developed and have money that they can invest in new technology and have citizens with wealth and well-established industries are in a much better position to decarbonise their economies and move away from old industries and fossil-generated industries. But then you've got other economies that are still developing, where people don't have refrigeration, they don't scarcely have lighting in their houses. So even that debate, which is a discussion we've been having for a considerable period of time, I don't think is necessarily well understood. If you throw into that equation all of these additional options and choices that we've spoken about today, it makes for a complicated equation. Any thoughts on how we can get some more clarity and information into this public discourse?
Well, one simple generic one, and scientists always ask for more money for science, is just to fund this research in a much more serious way. But I think not in just a bunch of centralized places. I think a key issue here is building trust. I think it's very important that the research be dispersed globally with a range of different voices. And I think we need a kind of structure where some people are really developing methods and much more people are in teams trying to figure out all the way those methods will fail. So that's the short answer. And I think there's actually a lot that could be learned quickly. I think in big picture, I think it's important to think about two kinds of errors. So the error that most people are worried about with solar geoengineering is the error of overconfidence, the error that we kind of assume it works, go down a pathway where we begin to deploy it, and maybe we're then cutting emissions a little more slowly than we otherwise would have, and then we find it doesn't work. Obviously, it's not going to be that binary, but just that's the story. And I think that's absolutely worth worrying about. And I'm one of the first people to use moral hazard in this context. I get it. But we have to remember the other risk, which is that we are so convinced that it doesn't work for a series of assumptions. And then we get to 2050 and we look back and kind of say, shit, we actually could have significantly reduced harm by doing some of these things, and we chose not to. And for that, we sacrificed people and ecosystems. And I think both risks are possible, and nobody knows exactly what the right answer is. But when people talk about uncertainty, uncertainty goes both directions. Uncertainty does not mean doing nothing, because we're in a dynamic, unstable situation. Doing nothing isn't an option.
Let's just go to some of the audience questions, because they go to that point that you just made. One question: if we want to provide maximum protection, would it be better to use fast cooling, such as solar reflection or cirrus cloud thinning, earlier or later? So if it is, for example, something that buys us some time, when should we be rolling it out? David?
So I have maybe a tricky answer. I actually think we should start relatively soon. but roll it out very slowly so you can watch for problems. So I think I often say if there was ever like a big decision with kind of a red button where you do it at massive scale, you don't, I think I would almost certainly never vote to do it. But luckily, that's not the way these technologies are. You could roll them out. There's no reason you couldn't build a wedge, is one of the ideas in climate policy of solar geoengineering, where you gradually begin to roll it out, and it may be quite a long time before it's bigger than natural variation. But locally, in some places, I mean, as Mitao was saying, what you can certainly do is test these things, their side effects locally. So you can't test the climate response. You can't do that for meters on the ground or aerosols or things in orbit. But you can test the local side effects. So you can test what a mirror on the ground and a set of mirrors on the ground does locally. In the same sense, you can test what higher amounts of aerosol in some part of the stratosphere or cirrus thinning does locally. And you can build out those tests looking for problems. So I think that it makes sense to start relatively early if we start at all.
Holly, have you got a view on that? Because often this discussion is framed around when all else fails, we turn to geoengineering. Perhaps, as David has said, perhaps earlier rather than later.
I mean, I understand the argument there, but I also think that, if we want to wait to do carbon removal until after we get decarbonization going, I think that the moral hazard risks for an early deployment are higher. Probably. I also think it would be really politically challenging to do it anytime soon. And I'm very disturbed by what we've observed with the response to COVID, where people pressed the lockdown button because they didn't know what was going on. They needed more data. That was very sensible. But then a year later are still pressing that and didn't use the time that they were supposed to buy with the initial lockdowns to actually do something about the pandemic. So, what's changed in our psychology and our institutions that we wouldn't display that same pattern with solar geoengineering if it was going to be deployed very soon? That's my concern.
I should also say that informing very much your work and your thinking on this is a social justice frame, if I could say that, and a concern about how any such policies and practices would affect those in the global south, those who don't have the financial resources of the wealthier developed countries. Do you think enough consideration is paid to that when we are having these discussions?
No, I think the discussions have been very dominated by politics and currents in the global north so far.
And Ye, do you think that we spend enough time considering what some of the possible unintended consequences might be of perhaps some of the geoengineering methods that you've spoken of?
So the methods that we consider, we would not really call them geoengineering. I think the best descriptor for our approach or framework is adaptive mitigation. Because on small scales, there are basically adaptive strategies. We have teams working on, for example, better ways and more efficient ways to capture solar energy and turning them into forms that's end-use energy forms that people actually need. So coming back to the question about how quickly to roll them out, I think for a strategy such as ours, on a small scale, we certainly should learn new and develop new technologies because they will help people regardless of whether we intend to scale up to have global mitigation effects. And in terms of renewable technologies, using glass mirrors is established. So on small scales, at least, we don't foresee any unintended consequences. One question that I get asked very often is, what about birds? Would they be blinded and disoriented? So actually, we don't really need to worry about if we place the mirrors not completely concentrating the light intentionally, then they wouldn't be harmed because it takes a lot of engineering to actually concentrate sunlight to a focal spot. So that's not something that bird lovers should worry about, but we get that question a lot.
And what about whether or not you'd be manufacturing the mirrors or manufacturing any of the other technologies that you've touched on today using fossil fuels, and whether the carbon emission that comes from the fossil fuel generated manufacturing process rules out any of the potential benefits that comes from the technology that you're pursuing?
So no, each mirror, when you make it, can offset much more than the fossil fuel emission used to make it, 10 times more. So if we were to scale quickly using fossil fuel power, we can still do it without having to worry about the emission backfiring. But of course, if we develop the technology early and carefully and really learn to use solar furnaces much more efficiently, we can transition the process entirely to, or mostly, to solar thermal, which has just a fraction of the equivalent CO2 emission compared to fossil fuel furnaces. Once again, just early investment and learning to do these things smart using renewable energy is, I think, something worth pursuing.
And Holly, in your work, you've said that we should be considering geoengineering and the question of it as part of a bigger picture, as part of a picture that would involve a rethink of agriculture, animal production, transport, and so on. Are we looking at this problem in a broad enough context?
I mean, I think the people right here are thinking about all those things. I think we saw a very comprehensive multi-sectoral discussion with regards to the mirrors and everything else. So I think that so far the discussion of geoengineering has been pretty siloed, but I think that will be less and less the case as people start to think through what it means to get to net zero by 2050. Say it really demands a transformation of a lot of systems, not just energy. So I think we're going to develop a literacy in all these types of transformations that are needed.
And David, I know that you've resolutely been avoiding pushing any technology on us, but do you think that we will see some of these technologies coming to fruition in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years?
I think solar geoengineering technologies will be deployed in the next 5 years. No, not at any meaningful scale. No, I don't. But I'm not, I think people's ability to see the future on this stuff is pretty much worthless. And the evidence is that people who are closer to technologies often are no better at predicting them. So I don't think it makes much sense to try and speculate.
And why is that? Why do you think that we're a further distance away?
Objectively, I mean, I've done a fair amount of work on technology forecasting, and objectively, people, if you look back at the estimates people made in the 1970s energy crisis of the way energy transformation would work, the estimates didn't have much predictive power. So I have no reason to believe that I have predictive power on these things.
Yeah, I mean,
I think what I can do is say things about environmental impacts and costs and stuff I know, and trade-offs. So I think we can say for near-term energy technologies, and there's a bunch of work that I've been involved in trying to understand how to use cheap solar to make hydrogen. There's a bunch of stuff we can say about what the potential is for cheap solar compared to, say, wind power in terms of environmental impacts. And I think between solar geoengineering technologies, there's definitely things we can say about environmental impacts of different technologies for sure. But I mean, if you're asking me to guess when they're used, that's really guessing a political outcome that I don't think people are good at guessing. I mean, who would have guessed the youth movement would have gone this quickly for climate? Very hard to guess. I've been involved in climate for 30 years, and I think things are changing quickly now.
Yeah, well, actually, that is a note of hope at the time when I need to wrap up the discussion. So thank you very much to the three of you for talking to us today. Fascinating session about some of the options that we face, some of the decisions that we face down the track. Thank you very much to Ye, David, and Holly for their wonderful contributions. I should say the next RESET.21 forum is happening on Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. So get online for that. Below Zero 2030 emergency action for negative emissions, notwithstanding that we've heard some caution around the use of that term emergency. Visit climateemergencysummits.org to register to attend, and there'll be live streaming online. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a great day and stay safe. Bye from me.
Bye-bye.